national stories are told in different ways. The Truth Commission brought out a report, it's in 5 volumes. Nobody looks at it. That's not the national story. It's there, and it's beautifully written. It's evocative. It's not just a dry technical report. But the story was the story while it was being told. We saw on the television, we heard, we saw the tears, we saw the people with their body language. We saw the nation, in a sense, speaking members of the nation to other members of the nation. And that's part and parcel of our history. And we saw the sergeant crying. The man who had power of life and death, and now he's crying. He's crying partly because the world around him has collapsed. So in that sense, that's part of the story. The other part of the story is implicit in a lot of the violence that was done was somehow whites are superior and blacks are inferior, and whites are destined to govern and to be in charge, and blacks are destined to serve and to be subservient. And we've had Nelson Mandela, and we've had black government for 20 years. And there are lots of problems with the government. It's black, it's got white people in it, people of Asian origin in it, and so on. But part of the myth of white supremacy and the myth of doing our best to help the black people was destroyed by the very process of transformation in our country and the ease with which people accepted parliamentary democracy and the strength of our courts. And now we have, I think, a number of brilliant judges in our courts, and they come overwhelmingly now, the top judges from the African community. And all of these things taken together are rewriting the narrative of South Africa. It's not just the details of the narrative, but the narrative of power, if you like, and the implications and the ideological understandings and the mindsets that play such an important role. So that enormous amount has been achieved there. During the worst apartheid period, a Professor Raymond Wax said that decent judges and moral judges should resign. At that stage, only whites could be judges. And he said, otherwise, they're simply providing legitimacy to a wicked system. And Professor John Dugard opposed him. And John said, no, people must use every opportunity they can, partly to prepare for the future and partly to mitigate the impact that the cruel and unjust system had. Those of us in the struggle overwhelmingly supported John Dugard. We knew it mattered to have, even if it was one judge to whom you could expose torture, one judge who would maybe strike down some laws, small laws, but it was something. One judge who would provide a space in which human dignity could be respected. We had to fight on every front, all the time, everywhere. In terms of my colleagues, well, there are very few of my colleagues who, when they're speaking, wave one arm because they didn't get involved in the struggle in the same way, mostly white in those days training. But many of them did excellent work as lawyers, and that's all they did. But they provided a dignified, decent defense. Sometimes they needed to be paid well, but they provided a dignified, decent defense, and some of the people who are alive today to carry on with the political transformation of our country owe that fact that they got good defense at that stage. So I wouldn't say that the mere fact that somebody is working as a judge today or working as a prosecutor or working as a lawyer in private practice, that in itself is something to be condemned. What is worrying is if people use their position there to blind themselves to really what law is supposed to be about, justice, humanity, human dignity, then that's worrying, but not the mere fact that they're occupying that position. But I don't know the situation well enough to know whether or not people are providing legitimacy simply by being there. What I do know is that one of my earlier meetings, 2 former judges spoke. They were brilliant. They were fantastic. They got there somehow, sometime. There must be more people. Hopefully there are lots of people sitting in this room who one day will become judges and will be inspired as judges and will help to bring about further transformation of the judiciary. I think what follows from that is it's not easy being a transformative judge. It's not that you sit up there and say, fantastic, now we wave the magic wand of progressive ideas and we're going to transform everything. You've got to be principled, you've got to be coherent, you've got to do it in a sustainable way. It's got to be something that's going to live beyond yourself and beyond that particular case. And that requires thought, and it requires a dialectic, and it requires argument and persuasion, and listening to multiple voices, and finding the right language and the right way of telling the story. I often say that judges are amongst the great storytellers of the age. Maybe they tell the story badly and in an awful way, but it is a story. Even a purely technical, inhuman story is a story. It's a sad story, but it's still a story. And that's why I would encourage people to have the ambition to become a judge one day, to become a good listener, to be collegial, to respect even colleagues who are much more conservative in their worldview than yourselves, but to have a spark of decency and dignity and respect inside them, find points of meeting, find ways of winning people over, because they represent a lot of people in the community. It's difficult. In terms of our court, when we started off, we had 150 senior judges at the time of our first democratic elections. 148 were white, 2 were black, 148 were men, 2 were women. A slight imbalance, you might say. And they'd all been appointed under apartheid, and many had actively supported apartheid. And we had a very, very vigorous debate on our court, the Constitutional Court, should the judiciary go to the Truth Commission and acknowledge the judiciary's failure under apartheid. And it's a very legitimate question. How were all these violations taking place if we had judges? And what was most interesting was the best judges, some of whom were on our court, the most fair-minded, the most in touch with the new values of the Constitution were the ones who wanted to go and say, we did something, but we didn't do enough. The ones who'd simply said we were just carrying out the law, they didn't want to go. They said the executive can't compel the judiciary to go forward. In the end, we couldn't get enough consensus. The Chief Justice, who had refused to take office under apartheid and done excellent work in an NGO called the Legal Resources Center, having been the top, most brilliant lawyer in private practice of his generation in Johannesburg, he wanted to maintain as much unity as possible in a judiciary undergoing transformation. And he didn't want us to be divided into the goodies and the baddies. And then they get labeled and they're denounced by the Truth Commission, and it's very difficult to proceed with justice in that way. So the compromise that we came up with was we wrote a statement signed by the top 4 judges in the country, 2 of whom were new, 2 of whom were old, saying, mea culpa, we failed. I think it's the only time a judiciary has actually said we failed. And as an institution, we failed in 2 respects. The one was we enforced vicious racist laws. It was done through the courts, by law, and sending people to jail because they loved somebody of a different color, evicting people from their homes because they belonged to the wrong racial group to live in a particular area, sending literally millions of people to jail because they couldn't produce documents on demand because they were black and they had to produce, and so on and so forth. And the judiciary was implicated very profoundly in the system of oppression and injustice, and it was necessary to recognize that. But it didn't stop there. There was a failure to show vigilance. When people claimed that they'd been tortured, and they came to court after being in solitary confinement for months and months and months, and you couldn't see the wounds and the injuries, and the judges would just dismiss the complaints and believe the police all the time. And that enabled terrible things to happen because there wasn't a vigilant judiciary. So don't give up on the judges. If you want to put more pressure on judges to uphold constitutional values and international standards, I don't think it's inappropriate for me as a visiting judge to say that. But don't give up on the judges. On the contrary, they are people doing quite important work for society in all sorts of ways. When you have marital problems, maybe, you have financial problems, there are problems of custody, there are problems of succession, all sorts of issues. We need judges in our society, and we need humane judges and decent judges and good judges. And I would encourage everybody to do what they can, to aim to get onto the bench, to contribute to the humanizing of what can often be a very remote and very instrumental and very technicist and very abstract and removed from real life kind of profession, to introduce more real life into it. The